Imagine a society trying to justify a rigid, oppressive class system, and someone drops this fact on them. Every single one of you started as dust, then became a microscopic drop, and then you were arranged in pairs.
Oh man, it completely shatters the illusion. I mean, when you strip away the velvet robes, the generational wealth, the golden crowns, you are left with the exact same elemental mud as the person sweeping the streets. It's like the ultimate biological veto on human arrogance.
Right. And that biological veto is, well, it's the engine of the massive paradigm shift we are unpacking in today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We are looking at a fiercely rational, socioeconomic lecture by Allama Ghulam Ahmad Parvez, specifically his analysis of a classical text, Surah al-Fatir, verses 11 through 23.
Yeah.
But our mission here isn't to look at this through the traditional lens of, theology or mysticism or the afterlife. Parvez reads this entire sequence as a systemic dismantling of biological, social, and economic hierarchies.
It really does.
He takes a text that has historically been read to justify passive fatalism, and he just extracts this blueprint that replaces a hierarchy of birth with a hierarchy of contribution and understanding.
And, to really grasp the sheer audacity of what he's doing, we kind of have to look at the context of his work. Because Parvez is writing and lecturing heavily in mid-20th century South Asia.
Right.
So this is a post-colonial environment, struggling with massive poverty, immense illiteracy, and a deeply entrenched feudal system where wealthy landlords hold pretty much total power.
And a cultural landscape that's just dominated by fatalism.
Exactly. People were poor, and the cultural narrative just told them, well, it's simply your destiny.
Wow.
So Parvez comes into this environment and insists that reading these ancient texts as like mystical spells or fatalistic decrees is a catastrophic error. He argues they're actually treatises on evolutionary biology, political economy, and systemic social structures.
I really want to spend some time on that because it reframes everything for you as a listener. Let's jump straight into the first core piece of his framework, which is the biological origin of the human being.
Okay, yeah.
The source text outlines a very specific sequence of creation. It says humanity is created from dust, then from a drop which Parvez translates as a life cell, and then arranged in pairs, meaning reproductive pairing.
Right.
And when I first read that, it sounded to me like a pretty standard creation myth. Man is made of clay, Adam and Eve, stuff like that. But Parvez takes this immediately into the realm of evolutionary biology.
It does, yeah.
I'm curious how he mutters from classical theology to, Darwinian mechanics.
Well, the linguistic mechanics of how he translates those terms is really where the genius lies. So he starts with the Arabic word turab, which is usually translated as dust or clay.
Right.
And traditionally, people visualize this literally, like an anthropomorphic god sculpting a human body out of wet mud, like a potter at a wheel.
Sure, the classic image.
Right. And Parvez notes that historically this literal interpretation made sense because human scientific knowledge hadn't really reached a level to understand the biochemistry of life. But he argues the word is actually describing inorganic, earthly matter.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's pointing to the primordial beginnings of life on Earth. So the mixing of water and earth to create a primordial soup from which the very first single literal life cell emerged.
Wait, so he's saying the text isn't describing the sudden magical manifestation of a fully formed human at all?
Not at all.
It's describing the chemical origin of all biological life, like inorganic matter becoming organic.
Exactly. And that transition to the organic is captured in the next word, nutfa, which traditionally meant a drop of fluid, often semen.
Okay.
But Parvez broadens the linguistic scope here based on its root meaning, which is a minute trickling entity. He identifies this as the foundational single cell, a microscopic organism invisible to the naked eye, thrashing about in the mud. And he explicitly notes that at this primordial stage, there is no male or female. It's a singular unit of life.
This is where his concept of timescales just blew my mind. He introduces this tension between the universe operating on autopilot versus human agency.
Oh, yes, the time compression.
Yeah. The idea is that when the universe is running on its own natural programming, when it's just this primordial soup trying to evolve, it takes a staggering amount of time. He references another part of the text that uses a poetic metric, saying one day is like 50,000 years.
Right.
So getting from that single cell in the mud to complex multicellular life took billions of years.
Yeah, because the evolutionary journey was agonizingly slow. It was purely environmental trial and error.
Yeah.
But Parwes draws a really sharp contrast when the text moves to the third stage, which is being arranged in pairs.
The human reproductive stage.
Right. Once you reach human reproductive pairing, the timeline compresses dramatically. Inside the room, that same microscopic drop of genetic material goes through all those evolutionary echoes. From a single cell to a complex organism with a nervous system and a beating heart.
It's wild to think about.
The universe took billions of years to figure that sequence out in the mud, but the human reproductive system executes it in 9 months.
I picture it like coding software. The universe spent 1 billion years writing the foundational code for biology, making countless errors, rewriting, debugging. And now the human body just hits compile and runs the entire program flawlessly in less than a year.
That is a perfect analogy, and not only does it hit compile, but the environment shifts from passive to active.
How so?
Well, the universe's default program was incredibly slow. Human biological participation accelerates it. Parwes calls this the transition of agency. Once human beings enter the picture, we're no longer waiting on the slow, passive crawl of natural selection in the mud. Human action becomes the catalyst for rapid development.
Which opens up a huge socio-political implication, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because if we ground human equality in this incredibly gritty biological reality, it fundamentally alters how a society functions. I mean, historically, practically every civilization has used some form of theology to justify kingship, caste, and class.
Absolutely.
You have the divine right of kings in Europe, the caste system in India, the concept of noble bloodlines everywhere. But how does Parwes' insistence on this purely biological origin strip away that political power?
Consider the psychological mechanism of aristocracy, right? It relies entirely on the myth of inherent superiority.
Right, they have to be better.
Exactly. The aristocrat must convince both himself and the peasant that his blood is literally of a different, higher quality. He has to believe he is ordained by the cosmos to rule.
So it's all a psychological game.
100%. If a foundational text, one that a society holds as sacred, forces everyone to acknowledge that their majestic royal origin story is actually just a single cell squirming in the mud, entirely indistinguishable from the peasant's origin story,
Right.
well, the entire philosophical basis for a class system just collapses.
You cannot claim divine superiority when you are constantly reminded that you started as sticky mud in a microscopic drop of fluid.
No, you can't.
It's an aggressive, deliberate social leveler. Parwes isn't just giving a biology lecture here. He is handing the working class a political diagnostic tool.
That's a great way to put it.
Because if everyone shares the exact same microscopic earthly origin, then any societal system that elevates one class based on their birth is inherently fraudulent. It defies the fundamental law of human existence. You are all dust, you are all a drop. Therefore, any hierarchy you build cannot be based on where you came from.
Right. He is replacing a hierarchy of lineage with a blank slate. We all start at zero, which forces a society to ask, if our status isn't determined by our birth, what determines our life trajectory? If the starting line is identical for the king and the street sweeper, how do their paths diverge?
And that pivot naturally moves us into what is probably the most explosive and honestly controversial part of Parwes' analysis, his all-out assault on the myth of fatalism.
Oh yeah, this is massive.
The source text has this sentence that says no lifespan is lengthened or shortened except in a book. And for centuries, the orthodox, traditional interpretation of this has been a strict, unyielding fatalism.
Right.
The idea that the exact second you are going to die, the amount of money you will make, the illnesses you will suffer, it is all written down in some mystical, metaphysical ledger in the sky before you were even born, and absolutely nothing you do can alter it.
And Parwes vehemently attacks this. He views fatalism not as a demonstration of piety, but as a psychological disease that destroys nations.
The disease.
Yeah, because it breeds passivity, intellectual laziness, and a complete abdication of human responsibility. I mean, if everything is pre-written, why build hospitals? Why study economics? Why fight for justice?
He actually exposes the cognitive dissonance of this belief using an incredibly relatable, almost satirical example. He talks about a devout fatalist who gets a 104-degree fever.
This is my favorite part.
Right. According to this person's stated theology, the fever was decreed by God. It is unalterable. It was written in a ledger.
Yeah.
But what does the person actually do in reality?
They panic. They don't sit calmly in their bed, resigning themselves to the cosmic ledger. They run frantically to the doctor.
Exactly.
They ask for medicine. They apply cold compresses. They actively fight the fever to bring it down to a normal temperature. Parwez is pointing out a massive contradiction here.
Because if the doctor were to ask, wait, why are you asking me for medicine to alter an unalterable divine decree? The fatalist has no logical answer.
None at all. They are simultaneously claiming the event is fixed by divine will, while frantically utilizing human science and medicine to fight it.
Because deep down, humans know that their actions matter. They know that applying the laws of medicine, the laws of nature, can actually alter the outcome.
Yeah, the instinct for survival just overrides the adopted theology. But rather than just calling them hypocrites and moving on, Parwez goes into the linguistics to explain why they misunderstand the text.
Let's get into that.
He retranslates the Arabic terms that built this fatalistic cage. The first is the word ashal, which traditional clerics almost universally translated as time of death.
Right, as if everyone has a built-in expiration date stamped on their forehead.
Exactly. But Parwez argues that ashal doesn't mean death at all. Linguistically, it refers to an interval or a duration, like the period between 2 points.
Okay, so a stretch of time.
Right. In the context of a human life, it's the duration between birth and death. It is a timeline, not a finish line. Therefore, an interval is inherently flexible. Your ajal, your lifespan, expands or contracts based on your actions.
Okay, wait. So if Ajal is a flexible interval, then what is the book? Because the text says the lifespan isn't lengthened or shortened, except in a book. If it's not a mystical ledger keeping track of fates, what is it?
For Parwez, the word kitab, the book, is a metaphor for the established law of nature.
Oh.
It is the universal system of cause and effect. So when the text says your lifespan is only altered in a book, it means your lifespan is dictated entirely by your adherence to biological and physical laws.
So the book is basically the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of biology, the rules of nutrition.
Yes.
If you eat well, exercise, and follow the rules of biology, your interval increases. If you swallow a bottle of poison, your interval decreases immediately. The book, The Law of Biology, dictates the consequence of the poison. It has nothing to do with God arbitrarily deciding you die on a Tuesday.
Precisely. He shifts the ultimate authority from arbitrary metaphysical whims to consistent, rational laws of the universe. And he doesn't just keep this at the individual level either. He scales it up to macroeconomics and sociology.
Does that work?
Well, he argues that entire nations and societies also have an awal, a lifespan. And a civilization's lifespan isn't predetermined by fate either. If a society institutes justice, economic fairness, and scientific inquiry, its lifespan extends. It flourishes for centuries.
Right.
But if it becomes corrupt, hoards wealth, oppresses its marginalized people, and ignores reality, its lifespan shortens rapidly and it collapses.
He brings up a devastating real-world metric to illustrate this, which is infant mortality.
Yeah, this is heavy.
In his time, and sadly still in many places today, people would watch children die of preventable diseases and comfort themselves by saying, oh, it was God's will, their ledger was short.
And Parwez finds this physically repulsive.
Yes. He says that in countries where children are dying like wilting flowers, it is absolutely not, because God wrote short lifespans for those specific children.
It is because the society is violating the book of nature. There is poor maternal nutrition, polluted water, poverty, and inadequate medical infrastructure. The society is failing.
The shortened lifespans are the direct biological consequence of a systemic, man-made failure, not a divine decree.
Exactly.
That is a staggering reframing of accountability.
Yeah.
Because think about how often do we use the way things are, or market forces, or fate as a shield to avoid taking responsibility for systemic failures.
All the time.
Parwez is basically saying that attributing a preventable death to fate is actually an insult to the design of the universe.
Yeah.
The universe provided the laws of health and abundant resources. We just built a corrupt society that fails to implement them.
And to really hammer home how absurd fatalism makes us, he uses another analogy that borders on dark comedy. He critiques the practice of certain extreme mystics or yogis who engage in prolonged breath-holding.
Yes, the breathing quota. This is such a wild concept to me.
Right. The underlying logic of these mystics is that God gave every human a strictly fixed numerical quota of breaths.
Okay.
Let's say your ledger says you get exactly 50 million breaths in your lifetime. Once you take the 50 millionth breath, you die.
So instead of living normally, these mystics retreat to isolated caves and intentionally slow their breathing down to a crawl, taking maybe 3 or 4 shallow breaths a minute.
Right. Their entire life strategy becomes, well, if I use my breath slower, God will be forced to let me live for 500 years until my quota runs out.
It is an attempt to hack the universe through a profound misunderstanding of how the universe actually operates.
Yeah, it reduces the majesty of human existence to a rigid, idiotic accounting error. And Parwes uses this as the ultimate example of how divorcing yourself from rational thought leads to absurd, life-denying behaviors. Instead of actively living, contributing to society, and utilizing your intellect, you are sitting in a dark cave hoarding oxygen.
Which is just isolated selfishness. And that is the exact opposite of what he prescribes for a functioning economy, isn't it? Because you aren't building anything, you aren't helping anyone, you're just trying to outsmart a ledger that doesn't even exist.
You're completely disconnected from the system.
Right. And that failure to participate organically bridges us to the next massive concept in his analysis. How a society should function and how it should draw value from all of its people. This centers on the imagery of the 2 Cs.
Yeah, the text presents a very vivid, almost poetic contrast here. It describes 2 distinct bodies of water flowing side by side. One is sweet, palatable, and thirst-quenching. The other is salty, bitter, and harsh.
Okay.
But the text makes a very specific, deliberate point. From both of these waters, humans extract fresh meat protein and ornaments, like pearls, and ships sail smoothly through both.
When I initially thought about this, my immediate, admittedly cynical reaction was, well, if one sea is bitter and salty, why wouldn't a society just wall it off?
Right, why bother with it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why not just stay in the sweet water, build your whole civilization there, and completely ignore the harsh, bitter water? Why go diving in the salty sea at all?
Because a healthy, robust economic system requires the resources of both, and the text guarantees that value exists in both. Parwes reads this entirely as a law of differentiated benefit. It's a blueprint for a political economy of absolute inclusion.
So how does that map onto a real society? What are the sweet and bitters in a societal context?
Well, in any complex society, you are going to have different environments, different demographics, and vastly different types of labor. The sweet water represents the comfortable, palatable sectors of society. Maybe these are the highly educated sectors, the comfortable urban centers, the white-collar professions, the tech hubs.
Right, the easy places to live.
Yeah. And the bitter water represents the harsh, marginalized environments, the hard manual labor, the rural farming communities, the rugged frontiers, the impoverished inner cities.
So if a society walls off the bitter water, they're literally starving themselves of half their potential resources. They miss out on the protein and the pearls that can only be found in those harsh environments.
Exactly. A system that ignores the bitter sea is a failed system. The political economy of inclusion dictates that true leadership finds a way to draw value, provide dignity, and integrate every single demographic.
So it's not a charity thing, it's an economic imperative.
100%. The failure isn't that the water is bitter. The failure is that the society hasn't figured out how to build the right ship to sail on it or the right nets to fish in it. If you look at a marginalized class and write them off as useless or a drain on resources, you are demonstrating your own economic incompetence.
There's another layer here that Parwes points out, which is that the 2 waters don't dilute each other. The sweet stays sweet, the bitter stays bitter. They maintain their distinct identities and characteristics, but the overarching system utilizes both harmoniously.
That is a crucial nuance. Parwes isn't advocating for a communist homogenization where every single person is forced into the exact same mold, turning everything into a bland, lukewarm puddle. He acknowledges that different sectors of society have vastly different cultures, different strengths, and different struggles. A good economic policy doesn't force the rural farmer to act like a city banker or the factory worker to become a philosopher. It respects their distinct environments. But it ensures that the overarching economic ship sails smoothly through both, providing equitable infrastructure so that both environments thrive.
Now, how does he connect this macroeconomic theory of the 2 Cs to the individual economic reality of the average person? Because he has a very specific redefinition of poverty in this framework.
He connects it through his profound analysis of 2 Arabic words, fakir and ghani.
Okay, break those down.
Usually, fakir translates simply as poor or beggar, and ghani translates as wealthy, but Parwes views these as systemic statuses, not just bank account balances. He argues that every single human is inherently a fakir, meaning we are all fundamentally dependent.
Like biologically dependent.
Yeah, we all have needs. We need food, shelter, community, and security. We are dependent on the cooperative system for our growth.
So it's not a derogatory term, it's just a statement of biological fact. We are needy creatures.
Exactly. I mean, taking that a step further, the tragedy occurs when a human is forced to beg another human for their basic survival. Because when one human relies entirely on the arbitrary whims of another human for their next meal, it creates a hierarchy of subjugation.
Right, the person holding the resources becomes a tyrant, a pseudo-god almost.
And the person begging loses their fundamental dignity. They are dehumanized.
So who are we supposed to be dependent on, if not each other?
Parwaz argues humans should only be dependent on the Ghani, which he redefines as the universal system, or the divine law that provides resources abundantly without needing anything in return.
So the system itself is the provider.
Yes. In a practical societal sense, this means the system should be set up so that the sweet and bitter seas both flow into a collective pool. The society's economic structure acts as the Ghani, providing for everyone's fundamental needs through mutual cooperation, infrastructure, and fair wages, not through humiliating interpersonal charity.
Right. If you have a society where people are forced to beg at the feet of corrupt politicians or rely on the patronizing charity of billionaires, that society has failed to utilize its two C's properly.
It absolutely has.
It has allowed a few individuals to hoard the sweet water and left the rest of the population to choke on the salt.
And when a society does that, when it hoards resources, crushes its marginalized communities, and forces people into intellectual and economic subjugation, it creates a very specific, devastating kind of societal rot. It creates a population of the walking dead.
Which brings us to the most piercing diagnostic part of Parwaz's framework, the living and the dead.
This is where it all comes together.
The text presents these incredibly stark, uncompromising contrasts. It says the blind and the seeing are not equal. The darkness and the light are not equal. The shade and the scorching heat are not equal. And ultimately, the living and the dead are not equal. And it culminates with this chilling, definitive phrase, you cannot make those in the graves here.
On a literal, superficial level, obviously, you cannot hold a conversation with a corpse. But Parwaz insists this is not a literal observation about a cemetery.
Right? Why would a profound text waste time stating something so incredibly obvious?
Exactly. For Parwaz, the graves represent walking dead people. It is a profound sociological diagnostic. He is talking about individuals, and often entire massive social classes, who have lost the capacity for critical thought, for growth, for questioning authority. Their intellect has flatlined.
So they are biologically respiring, their hearts are beating, they're eating food, but intellectually and socially they are corpses.
He draws a sharp distinction between merely breathing and actually living. As he points out, wolves, sheep, and insects breathe. Biological respiration is not the defining characteristic of human life.
What is it then?
Human life is defined by active, rational engagement with reality, the pursuit of knowledge, and the capacity to align oneself with the laws of nature to improve the environment. If you abandon that capacity, if you surrender your intellect to blind dogma, superstition, or pure survival mode apathy, you are functionally dead. You are in a grave of your own making, or a grave this society dug for you.
He illustrates this with an absolutely blistering critique of shrine culture in South Asia, which serves as the perfect, tragic example of this intellectual death in action.
Yeah, the visual he paints is hard to forget.
He describes scenarios where living, breathing humans travel miles to go to the tombs of deceased saints. They throw themselves on the dirt, weeping, begging the dead corpses beneath the soil for favors, asking them for a child, for wealth, or for a cure to an illness.
It is the ultimate inversion of reality and a symptom of absolute despair.
Yeah.
The living, who possess agency, intellect, and the physical capacity to change their circumstances through action, are humiliating themselves before literal dust. Parwaz ruthlessly points out the absolute powerlessness of the dead.
He says, when these so-called saints die, we have to bathe them, wrap them in cloth, and bury them under 10,000 pounds of dirt. They cannot even swat a fly away from their own faces.
Right, they cannot bring themselves a glass of water, yet living humans project infinite magical power onto this dirt.
And he highlights the grotesque economic reality of this system, too. It's not just harmless superstition. It is an economy of exploitation. While the poorest, most desperate people are groveling in the dust, giving their last few coins to the caretakers of these shrines, those caretakers are amassing massive wealth.
Oh yeah, building doors of solid silver for the tombs of corpses, while the people begging outside cannot even afford a thatched roof to keep the rain off their own children.
It is an economy built entirely on the exploitation of the intellectually dead. The dead in the graves are being used as a prompt by the elite to exploit the walking dead above ground.
It keeps the masses docile, begging ghosts for help instead of demanding accountability from their living leaders.
I have to push back here, though, and this is something I struggled with when reading his analysis. Labeling an entire demographic, especially a desperately poor, marginalized demographic that resorts to shrines because they have nothing else as dead, sounds incredibly harsh.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
It sounds kind of elitist, like a judgment from an ivory tower, writing them off entirely as lost cause.
Yeah.
How is this not just blaming the victim?
That is a vital concern, and if misread, it can absolutely sound elitist. But the nuance there is that Parwes frames this strictly as a diagnostic, not a condemnation of their character. Think of a doctor diagnosing severe necrosis in a patient's limb. The doctor isn't judging the limb, they are identifying a fatal systemic failure in the body's circulation.
Oh, okay.
Parwes is asking the systemic question. What does a society do when its ideology, its grinding poverty, or its brutal political oppression has rendered entire classes intellectually dead?
So they aren't dead because they inherently want to be ignorant. They are dead because the system systematically suffocated them.
Consider the historical alternative. If a person is forced to work 16 hours a day in a brick kiln just to afford a single piece of stale bread, they do not have the luxury of philosophical inquiry.
Of course not.
They do not have the energy to study the book of nature. Their environment has forced them into a state of intellectual hibernation just to survive. The profound tragedy of the shrines is that the people go there out of immense desperation, precisely because the actual living society, the government, the economy, the medical system has totally abandoned them. When the living refuse to help you, you turn to the dead.
Wow. That entirely shifts the meaning of the phrase, "you cannot make those in the graves" here. It's not an insult. It's a warning to reformers and intellectuals. It's saying you cannot just preach high-minded philosophy or abstract science to people who are crushed by systemic oppression and steeped in generations of engineered ignorance.
Right. You can't just stand at the edge of the graveyard and shout at the dead to wake up.
It's physically impossible. You cannot argue someone out of a desperate superstition using logic if their stomach is empty.
You have to change the environment first. You have to dismantle the oppressive systems that killed their curiosity in the first place. You have to provide the sweet water of economic opportunity, healthcare, and education. Only by changing the systemic environment can you resuscitate the walking dead. You must hand them a loaf of bread and secure their dignity before you hand them a book.
And this diagnostic framework completely redefines who the elite or the scholars actually are in a functioning society. Because traditionally, the scholars are the clerics, the ones memorizing ancient texts.
Yeah.
But Parwes brings up a specific verse that says, "Of his servants, only those who have knowledge truly fear him." For centuries, this was interpreted to mean that religious clerics, the ulama, are the ones who truly fear God, and therefore they hold the highest status.
Parwes shatters that interpretation by delving into the Arabic concept of fear used in this context. The word used isn't the cowering, trembling terror of a peasant standing before a cruel, unpredictable monarch.
What is it?
The fear linked to this specific type of knowledge that ulama is about profound, overwhelming awe. It is the awe that comes from deeply understanding how the intricate, massive systems of the universe work.
So the learned aren't the people reciting dogma without understanding the mechanics of reality?
Far from it. For Parwes, the true scholars, the ones who experience this genuine awe, are the scientists, the embryologists, the sociologists, the economists.
That makes so much sense.
Think about the person who looks through an electron microscope at a dividing cell, who actually understands the billions of years of evolution, the intricate coding of DNA, the sheer statistical improbability of life. That person experiences true awe. The person who understands the delicate, interconnected balance of a global ecosystem or the intricate mechanics required to build a perfectly fair economic system, they are the ones who truly understand the book, the laws of nature.
So an astronomer charting the life cycle of a dying star, or a doctor understanding the precise pharmacology needed to cure a fever, they are demonstrating an infinitely higher alignment with reality than a mystic holding their breath in a cave for a decade.
They are. Because the scientist is actively engaging with the laws of creation to yield a tangible, beneficial result for society. They are expanding the lifespan of humanity. The mystic, on the other hand, is trying to bypass the laws of creation through an illusion, contributing nothing. Parwes utterly destroys the hierarchy of religious piety, which is often passive, and replaces it with a hierarchy of functional knowledge and active contribution. Your status isn't based on how many rituals you perform. It's based on how deeply you understand the universe and how actively you improve the human condition.
This is a breathtakingly rational vision.
Yeah.
Alama Parwez takes a text that has been buried under centuries of mystical dust and fatalistic resignation and reveals a highly engineered, fiercely logical blueprint for a progressive, scientifically grounded, economically fair civilization.
He really does.
Let's synthesize this journey, because the map he draws is incredibly cohesive.
It functions as a complete progressive architecture for human differentiation.
First, we all share a common, gritty biological origin: dust and a microscopic drop. Inorganic matter becoming organic life. This permanently and entirely destroys any claim to hierarchy by birth, lineage, or noble blood. We all start at absolute zero, together, in the mud.
Second, because our birth doesn't determine our trajectory, our actions must. We reject the poisonous myth of fatalism. There is no predetermined lifespan or fixed destiny.
Yeah.
The book is the law of nature, and our individual lifespans, as well as the success of our societies, expand or contract based entirely on our active alignment with those biological and sociological laws.
Third, as we act and build this society, we must recognize that different environments produce vastly different values, the sweet and the bitter seas. A functional moral economy doesn't wall off or discard the bitter. It builds the infrastructure to draw protein and pearls from every single demographic, practicing the political economy of absolute inclusion.
We are all dependent on the system, the Ghani, rather than subjugated by each other.
Yes. And finally, our ultimate status in this society is determined by our capacity for active, rational thought. Are we the living who engage with reality, seek profound scientific and sociological knowledge, and contribute to the system? Or are we the dead, trapped in the graves of superstition, fatalism, and systemic apathy, begging ghosts to fix our reality?
He demands that we stop asking the dead for favors and start taking fierce, uncompromising responsibility for the living. He takes the power away from the kings, the fatalists, and the shrine keepers, and hands it directly to the scientists, the workers, and the active participants in reality.
If you truly internalize that you began as nothing more than inorganic dust in a microscopic drop of fluid, you realize that everything you are now, and everything your society currently is, must be built through relentless action, not inherited by divine right. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to mull over as you step back into your reality today. If your true value in a society isn't based on your lineage, your inherited wealth, or some unalterable fate written in the stars, but is based entirely on your active capacity for growth and your engagement with reality, which parts of your worldview are currently living, and which parts are just walking dead habits you've passively inherited?